Alright, hello and welcome. So I wanted to take today to talk about the Saryn rework. This is fast approaching. It could come out as early as next week, and we have a number of details about it already. That being a full dev workshop on it, which we're going to be going over, and in addition to that, at the beginning of Primetime 207, it was gone over by Pablo and Rebecca on stream for a good amount of time, showing off what its current form is on dev build, and that is representative of the dev workshop we got. So let's get into this. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of this word by word because that would be a terrible video. So let's just paraphrase real quick before getting into the actual changes of the abilities. So first and foremost is tackling perplexing synergies. What this basically means is nobody's really quite sure what on Saryn is supposed to work the way it does and what's a bug and what does Miasma do when enemies have like spores on them. Nobody's really sure. So we're just going to fix this and make it good and consistent, and that's wonderful. In addition to that, they'd like to tackle underused abilities, those being Molt and Toxic Lash. Molt, I think, is maybe a bit underserved in this current iteration. However, Toxic Lash, well, we'll get to that when we get to that. In addition to that, this is the bit that I feel is rubbing people the wrong way, which is tackling the Spores turret. So Molt is losing its ability to have spores put on it, which means that it is killing the build where you put your 2 down, you put spores on it, and then you shoot it with like a torrid, and it spreads to all of the weak baby enemies that couldn't live through a stiff wind, and they all die. You know, the build that you'd see on like Hydron or like on IO and all that business. Killing those maps is a thing that Saryn has been capable of. However, it has been quite a bit of time that Saryn has not even been the best at doing that. Gara and still Banshee are both better at that job than Saryn is and has been. So if you hate that they're taking away your Spores turret, probably just use Gara or Banshee again. I don't understand why people are complaining about losing the Spores turret. It was never really that good anyway. In addition to that, let's talk about these ability changes. So, first and foremost, general changes. Both Saryn and Saryn Prime are getting more armor. I don't think this armor is going to make a huge difference in the long run, but it'll be nice to have a little bit more survivability, no matter which way you slice it. And then, getting into the first and most massive change, Spores. So, Spores now have infinite duration, and their damage escalates up to a cap of 100,000 damage per tick. That is a lot. That's a lot of potential damage that you can kick out. The way that this works is that per tick, it will escalate. If there are ticks on multiple enemies, all ticks escalate. So if you have one enemy and it ticks, let's say it goes from 10 to 15 damage. If you have 2 enemies and it ticks and it goes from 10 to 20 damage. You can see how this could get out of hand with like 30 enemies in a room. That will be very strong and do a lot of damage. This was doing a hefty amount of damage to level 1000 heavy gunners with no mods in Saryn Prime. So I have some pretty high hopes for this ability now, and I think one of the major problems with it is it's going to be kind of hard to spread spores when anything a spore touches instantly evaporates. I see some recasting in my future because enemies can't live through it long enough for it to escalate to higher amounts of damage, which is not really a problem, but I will say, because Pablo is revisiting Saryn, I get the feeling Pablo has some overkill tendencies, because Nidus also has the problem of enemies being just way too weak for what he can kick out. So, we may be seeing a repeat of previous events in terms of that. Not that that's an issue. A Warframe being too strong is not really a problem, I suppose. In addition to this, the effect that her spores have has been changed to corrosive damage, which means these are going to be armor stripping monsters in combination with the status chance going from 10% to 50% base, which scales with power strength. That means these spores are going to be taking out like so many corrosive procs, and armor is pretty much just going to not exist. And I know what a lot of people are probably thinking, well, we used Viral because a bunch of enemies don't have armor anyway because of corrosive projection. I understand where you're coming from, but as a general use Warframe, this is going to help Saryn a lot, I think. And while I think Viral or Corrosive would still do very, very well, and Viral would probably do better in a constructed group, I think we're going to be just fine with this, given the damage numbers that I saw kicking out on the enemies on stream. With that, any enemy that dies from Spores will spread Spores, so that's good. And Toxic Lash now affects your guns, so you can spread Spores with that. And even if allies kill enemies that have Spores on them, it will still spread Spores, so allies can't, screw you out of spreading your Spores. All that stuff, absolutely fantastic. In addition to that, Venom Dose, which is the augment that nobody used, is going to be changed to corrosive damage, and it was toxin damage. That's pretty irrelevant, but it's a thing that exists. And then we're going to go to Molt. So, Molt obviously is getting its synergy removed, which is somewhat of a good thing. I know a lot of people are going to be unhappy with that. But beyond that, I don't think Molt is getting enough to make people still want to use it. So what it's getting is that after casting Molt, Saryn is going to get a movement speed bonus, which is honestly neither here nor there in my mind. I'll have to see for myself, and if it's significant enough, then I guess that'll be cool and maybe worth casting for that. But in general, I feel like that's not really what Saryn needed. With that, though, the actual Molt itself is going to scale like Rhino's Iron Skin, so it'll be invulnerable for 3 seconds, and during that time, it will build up any damage that it takes in and gain that much damage as HP after those first 3 seconds, so it's going to be a lot hardier. That being said, distraction tech is just kind of not very useful, I find, in Warframe. We have so many ways to, actually diffuse an enemy, if you would, with various stuns and things and blinds and all that a distraction method is maybe not amazing, and I would probably prefer Molt work some other way, maybe being a extra layer of health or something like that could scale off of her now improved armor. There's a lot of ways that it could go that I think would be better, but this is probably not as much as she needed, let's say. With that, regenerative Molt is still going to exist. That being a required thing in order for Saryn to heal is maybe not great, but she's getting a lot of other stuff, and Molt not being the best ability ever is probably going to be fine in the end, as much as I would like it on paper to be very, very good. Obviously, with all of these changes, I'm going to need to test them whenever they actually come out to really get a feel for it, and Molt might end up being amazing, but I just don't have high hopes for it right now. Things that I do have high hopes for, though, is Toxic Lash. So, out of all of these changes, Toxic Lash is the number one thing that I think is going to get fucking absolutely nuked from orbit. The way that this is worded, and the way that it worked on stream, seems, let's call it, really overtuned. So, while Toxic Lash is active, your weapons will trigger Toxin status effects on any damage instance. Okay, so Toxin... The thing about Toxin, we don't use it a whole lot. Recently, with the Hystrix, we got kind of a reintroduction to it. Toxin scales like slash damage that doesn't ignore armor. We've already gone over that Spores are going to strip a ton of armor. So if you have every weapon you have basically getting a second slash proc on every single hit, that's fucking insane. That is so much potential damage for you to be kicking out. Like that on a beam weapon, that on an Ignis, every enemy that gets hit by every tick of your Ignis Wraith gets a Toxin proc that builds up and scales into itself. That's a lot of damage. That will hurt. That's not some bitch damage. That's a lot. That's a lot of potential damage. And the duration of this went from 30 seconds to 45 seconds. And it'll also spread Spores like you would expect. Your guns can now spread Spores with Toxic Lash activated by just hitting them anywhere. That's also great, but the main thing is that the amount of damage just on a base level that this ability is going to be able to do is absolutely ridiculous. Contagion Cloud might actually be crazy, because if Contagion Cloud works on if you hit them with any Toxic Lash weapon and that Toxin proc kills them and it makes a gas cloud out of that, Contagion Cloud might just be straight up OP. I see a lot of bad shit going down where Toxic Lash is like the most insane, soul-crushing, enemy-clearing thing that exists, just based off of how it was shown, and its combination potential with Spores, which also looks pretty good right now. So if anything isn't going to stay how it is in this workshop, I think it's going to be Toxic Lash because it seems nuts. With that, let's get to the other thing that's probably not great, which is Miasma. So Miasma and Spores, they actually swapped damage types, with Miasma now being viral. It is pretty much going to always proc viral and do some damage. The damage went up from 350 to 500 base. It guarantees a viral proc, so it's actually doing basically, in effect, double that, because it's doubling all of your damage. And the duration went from 3 to 5 seconds, which means it gets extra ticks of damage over time. Its stun is also still there on initial cast, but you can't spam it for, like, stun after stun after stun. And it seems probably functional, but this ability could probably use like a 5-meter base range increase, because I believe it is a 15-meter base range currently, which just doesn't really seem like enough. If it was 20 or like even like 18, I could see this ability potentially being useful, but right now I don't think it covers enough area, even with a range build, for you to really want to spend 100 energy on it. That being said, that's obviously a very, very easy fix. That's just making the number 15 a little bit higher to give it some more, like, range, as it were, I suppose. So that's cool. In addition to that, Saryn is also getting an audio rework. Danielle has done some voices for it, and I'm sure that will be wonderful. The sound design of the game has improved such a degree over, like, the last 2 years that it's, like, absolutely ridiculous. So I expect those sounds to be wonderful. But yeah, overall, going into this, I expected this to just be a nerf. Like, after, like, my initial reaction was, oh, the Spores turret, they're just going to nerf it into the ground. But after actually reading this and watching what they showed on stream, I'm actually kind of hyped for this rework to actually be out and for me to get my hands on it and to test it. Because the combination of Spores and Toxic Lash, those abilities sound so strong at this point that they might actually be crazy oppressive and too strong. So that's a good way for a rework to come out and then be tuned down a little bit, maybe. With that, that's the Saryn rework, and I will see you guys tomorrow.